My name is Warren Brown. I'm a professor in the School of Psychology. I've been here 32 years, or 33, or something like that. So I overlap with most of the, actually even with Neil to a degree. So I've kind of been here through a lot of this. Newt gave us the cue words here. History, 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 right, Newt? And what we want to do is to kind of revisit and think about our history. If you don't know your history, you're bound to relive it, and usually the bad parts. And so we want to kind of get a chance to think about where we've been and kind of nail that down for us. Before we get going too much further, I'd like to have all the former School of Psychology faculty that are here stand up, just so we can recognize you. Besides history, there's also, in the words of Fiddler on the Roof, tradition. And so what we want to do is also visit and think about the traditions of the School of Psychology and the thing that anchor us as we go into the future. And I want to introduce our panel today, which were all of the previous deans with the exception of Lee Travis. And besides history and tradition, there's also social context. And in order to kind of re-anchor our minds in the context of the School of Psychology at that time, I want to remind you of Academy Award-winning films during the epoch of the deans. So Travis was dean during the period of The Sound of Music, In the Heat of the Night, Patton, Godfather. That was not Travis. More like A Man for All Seasons, where you can kind of begin to think through what society was like, what we were like in the era of Lee Travis. Then it's great to have with us Dr. Neil Clark Warren. Dr. Warren was dean from 1975 to 1982. That was the era of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Rocky, Kramer versus Kramer, and Chariots of Fire. And then Dr. Archibald Hart, 1982 to 1995, excuse me, appropriately out of Africa. Amadeus. I don't know if you're that musical. I came during that era, so Rain Man probably works. Schindler's List, Forrest Gump. Arch is a man with so many talents that. And then Dr. James Guy, from 1995 to 2000, Gladiator. Titanic. The English Patient. And then Dr. Winston Gooden from the year 2000 to the present, A Beautiful Mind. Lord of the Rings. No Country for Old Men. The Artist. And I don't know if it'll win a Oscar, probably not, but my deep respect for Winston, the movie Mandela. So we are going to have a chance to talk about the School of Psychology over the years and the kind of things that were happening. And I'm just going to ask a question and just allow you to go historically, starting with Neil and then Arch and Jim and Winston, and talk about how you would characterize the School of Psychology during the years you were dean, things like faculty, students, the wider, fuller atmosphere. What was it like back then?
I think Man Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was kind of...
Is the mic on?
I need to be closer. I've had my wife say that many times. I just have to say that when Paul and I came in 1967, we had quite a special faculty. We didn't have Newt Maloney yet. We didn't have Hart yet. And we had a faculty that was a bit unusual. But one of them was only there periodically. Al Stratmeyer knows about this. He came in a little bit later. This was Don Cole. And Don Cole would fly all over the world for the Air Force. The Air Force just loved his speaking, but he wouldn't tell anybody that he had left. And so he would just put up on the board that he would be back at a certain time, and the class would resume at that time. But Don Cole one time was speaking at the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, and Don was telling us the story when he got back, and he said that something kind of unusual had happened to him there. He said he was up in this high pulpit, and he knew that his time was about up, and so he needed to, he said when he preached, he was very passionate. When he preached, his shirt tail would always come out. And so he said he knew he needed to do something about that before the end of his sermon. And so he said during the last 15 minutes or so of his sermon, he just did a lot of tucking. He said he preached and tucked and preached and tucked. And so he came down out of this high pulpit for the benediction. And as he came down, he noticed a lot of people in the crowd going like that. And he heard a loud bang behind him. He had tucked the Air Force flag into his pants. That's sort of symbolic of, I think, the faculty we had at that time. I just jotted down some notes. All of you, I look out and see so many close friends. It's just so great to see you and to be with you again. It's been a long time since I was here. 82 Arch would be 18 and 14, 32 years ago. So it was a long time ago. But almost every person you look at, you say, I see Ken Polite over there, I see Bob Richard over there, and Paul Clement, of course, and Kathy. And all of you are just such friends of mine, and you've continued through the years, and we've gone separate ways, but we haven't in a way. I cannot today turn this over to Arch without talking about what I consider to be the greatest woman I ever knew, and that is Marnie Fredrickson. Yes. Marnie Fredrickson, for some of you who maybe came a little later, retired in 1982 after 19 years of being the assistant, and she was certainly very, very crucial to Lee Travis. I think you'd have to say that our parentage was Lee Travis. He was our father, and we were so proud of him. He wrote 250 articles and books, and he was just an amazing, amazing man who carried himself with more grace than any person I've ever known. And we would kid him about driving this big Lincoln over from Bel Air over there in Encino. And he said to me one time, he said, if I could drive a tank over here, that's what I would drive. He was just a very, very graceful man who had been 30 years, I think, at USC. And before that, at the age of 27, he had been head of the Department of Psychology at the University of Iowa. And in 1965, I suppose, 64, 65, he had a conversion experience. He hadn't been in a church for 50 years. And he went up and heard Louis Evans speak at Bel Air, and he had a conversion experience. He said he started crying. He didn't want to let Lisa know about that because he was embarrassed about it. But he said to Lisa, let's go back next week. And so she said, you want to go back to church next week? Because they were just gone there for the dedication of the church. And they went back next week, and he had a full-blown conversion experience that he writes about. He was our father. We loved him with all of our hearts. We honored him, didn't we, Arch? And Marnie was our mother. I don't know, Cliff Penner once said that he thought that almost every student, every faculty member in the school was in love with Marnie Fredrickson. Literally. And we just adored her, and she adored us. And it was a very debilitating thing to find out that Marnie Fredrickson could write letters for me that were 10 times as good as I could write for myself. I could have just sat in my office and done nothing, and it would have been a better 7 years for me. And then it's very, very interesting. You see, you have these contrasts. You have the Weyerhausers, now I have to say. It was Weyerhausers back in that day. I tell Bill all the time, you know, he changed his name. It seems unfair that he got to change his name, but he did. And I've gotten to know Ben and Drew really well, their sons, and they're just wonderful people. So you had the Weyerhausers, and you would never meet a more graceful person in the world than Annette Weyerhaeuser. And it was her inspiration that got John Finch down here. And John Finch delivered those first lectures. And John brought this existential approach that really set the boundaries for where the school was going. And he had just this background in philosophy and psychology from Drew University, I think, primarily. And he had such a close relationship with the Weyerhausers. And then they brought in 2 faculty people who couldn't have been more different in terms of background. Paul Clement he studied ground squirrels. I mean, that was his specialty. From the University of Utah, and they brought me from Carl Rogers, University of Chicago. And I felt inferior to him the entire time. I mean, anybody who could do research on ground squirrels, you know, was way ahead of where I was. So then we put out a little paper and asked people to sign up on it, and if they were interested in Fuller Seminary, and we got an applicant from it. It was Newt Maloney. He came from somewhere in Alabama or Georgia or Vanderbilt or somewhere. I don't know. But it was in the South, I knew that. And
He was a Methodist, you know.
he was a Methodist. That was the other thing that was kind of weird about him. But we all came to adore Newt Maloney. There was nothing that he wouldn't do to bring honor to people and to bring laughter into their lives. We fought hard to get Arch Hart here from South Africa. It was really a battle to get somebody into the country. And we got the help of the senator from Oregon. No, yeah, Ronald Reagan, but I'm thinking, Mark Hatfield. We got the help of Billy Graham. We got the help of everybody we could to try to get Arch into the country, and that was well worth the effort because Arch then served so well. I'll just say one last thing. We had an executive committee. Arch has never agreed with me on the importance of an executive committee. So when he became the dean, he told me, he said, I got rid of that. At executive committee, he said I thought it was a waste of time. We had 5 people on our executive committee. We had Al Stratmeyer, we had Paul Clement, we had Newt Maloney, and we had Arch Hart, and we had myself. And we used to try very hard to get consensus on everything, and I think that kind of carried us through a very difficult time. And on that, I will pass the mic along to Arch. All I can say, it was a great honor to be here. It was a great honor for me to get to know all these people. And to this very day, when I go someplace, I meet somebody who is from the Graduate School of Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. Now, you understand, I would much rather if they told me that they had been a customer of eHarmony, but
Thank you, Neil. I do want to highlight one important issue, and that is the one, there are two members of that early faculty that I want to identify. The one is Don Tweedy, who sadly passed away just weeks ago, who was going to be here at this event, and who would have been, he was the very first director of our clinic that was appointed. Originally, the thought was that we had to have a clinic going before we could have any students. And Don, I believe, was the first person to do that. And throughout all his career with us was a tremendously helpful person. But the other person I want to highlight, and Neil has already mentioned him, but Paul Clement is sitting there, and would you stand, Paul, just for a moment so that they can see you? He was Travis's first selection, I think, for the rest of you. And he came with a phenomenal connection to APA. His expertise as in child development clinic, he developed, I think, what was the most outstanding child development clinic you can ever imagine. It was sad when it closed down, but Paul was the person, he was director of clinical training. And when in the early 70s, 71, we began to think about getting APA accreditation, Paul was the one who took the lead, led the way. And when they came back denying our accreditation in 72 or so, Paul went to bat. Through his expertise and his contacts in APA, he was able to convince them to send another team visit. And that team visit finally gave us our accreditation. But I remember so clearly, because I was visiting from South Africa during that year, that it was single-handedly Paul Clement who converted the American Psychological Association. And eventually, they into their regulations, there was a thing called footnote 3. Paul, do you remember the footnote 3? So we owe Paul a great debt of gratitude, and Kathy as well. Thank you. My introduction to Newt Maloney, he had his office next to me. And this was in the first year of my being there, and I was seeing a client, he was seeing a client, and then I heard this bing, bang, bodies flying around, screaming, going on in the office next to me. And I excused myself from my client. I just had to go and check up. The sign said, "Do not disturb," but the noise was so loud, it looked like murder was being committed. I pushed the door open and peered in, and I'm not exaggerating. There was Newton relaxed in his chair. There was a man holding a plastic bat, pinning down his wife on the seat. And I have this visual picture, I can't get rid of it, of this guy turning around to see who was coming in the door, holding this thing down. That was the era of, venting your anger and all the rest of it. But I have never forgotten that scene. So you taught me quite a lot, Newton. there is so much I can share, but I confine myself to two stories, and maybe that there's more time at the end. The first story I want to share is how I came to be at Fuller. I was a civil engineer in my first life. But in about 1962, a small group of students from Fuller Seminary came to South Africa, came to our city to conduct an evangelical mission, headed by one of the members was, in fact, Dick Peace, who is on the faculty of the School of Psychology, but there were 4 of them. And when they returned from South Africa, I had, at that point, started in on my clinical psych studies. When they returned, a year or 2 later, Dick Peace sent me a letter to say that the seminary was creating a Christian-based clinical psychology program, and that they had appointed Lee Edward Travis as the dean. Well, it just so happened at that time, this was about 1967, 68, I had been doing a lot of research in electroencephalography, and as you know, Lee was the very first person in the United States to do brainwave recordings. I knew all his literature. I knew how in the mid-60s he had founded the American Speech Pathology Association, and here is this letter saying that Lee Edward Travis is now the dean of this new school, and I said, well, it cannot be the same Lee. It must be his son or something. I wrote a letter to that Lee Edward Travis and got a letter back saying, yes, I am that guy. And a bond clicked right at that moment. I wanted to be working with that man. And I wrote back, I offered to quit my studies in South Africa and come and take the program here, and he said, no, finish your degree in South Africa, and then come as a scholar, as a visiting scholar. And I took his advice in 71, the beginning of 71. I packed up my wife and my 3 daughters, one sitting right there, and we drove all the way through Europe and England and in Boston and to here. I remember so clearly the school was a double-story house on the parking lot outside. I remember pulling up, the folks who had fetched us, getting out of the car, because I wanted to see the School of Psychology, and I looked at that building, dilapidated, 2 stories, and my heart sank. My heart sank. I was ready to get back in the car and go back to South Africa. But I thought I'd go in, and we went in, and the first person we met was Marnie Fredrickson. Something changed. She was phenomenal. And she just loved us and invited us. And that night we had dinner with Don Tweedy. He invited us when he was finished with his last client to come for dinner. What he didn't tell me was that it was to be 10 o'clock at night. That was when he was finishing his dinner. And ever since, we went back to South Africa. But I have a little story about Paul. Because in late November, we were going to leave in early December. Late November, Paul took me to lunch. He doesn't remember this, I'm sure. And took me to lunch. And we sat down together, and he shared with me that the faculty had been discussing whether or not to invite me to come and join the faculty. But he said, we have a problem. He said, you are not assertive enough. You haven't asked us, you've not approached us. And that was the era of assertiveness. It was the big thing. They were doing assertiveness seminars all around the country. Our graduates who were leaving and going into businesses, all assertiveness was the big, big, big thing. And I didn't have enough assertiveness. So I said to Paul, just lean forward and let me explain something to you. What you Americans have to understand, that assertiveness is defined differently in different cultures. In my culture, if you want me You ask me. I don't go. And shortly after getting back home, there was a letter from Lee Travis. So Paul took me seriously, and that then led finally to my coming. One last story. When I became dean, David Hubbard, President Hubbard, called me aside. He had two messages for me. The first message was, I don't want you as dean to do fundraising. Neil Warren had been fundraising for several years, building us an very, very generous fund. But the development office nose was sort of put out a little bit. So Hubbard didn't want me to fundraise. I said, hallelujah. I'm so thankful for that. The second story, he said to me, one of the things you need to know about being a dean in the United States is that you have to keep a lot of secrets. There are going to be many things going on that you have to keep secret. That means you're going to get blamed for lots of things. You'll be a scapegoat. Live with it. And frankly, my deanship was living with those secrets where I took the blame for a lot of things. One of those secrets I think I can share with you tonight. So it's not been shared ever since. Larry Dane Beston, who was then our provost, a former surgeon from UCLA, called me in one day and said, we've got the marriage and family program. I'm doing this because there were comments about the marriage and family program earlier. The marriage and family program. And he said, Larry sat me down and said, I don't think that school, that program should be in the School of Theology. I think it should be in the School of Psychology. Go and change it. So I went back to the faculty and I suggested the idea and they hit the roof, the clinical faculty. They weren't interested in having marriage and family come and move in with the clinical faculty. And they voted it down. So I went back to Larry to tell him, look, I'm sorry, but the faculty just are not open to that move. But Larry said, oh yes, since we last met, I've been going through the books. And the marriage and family program in the School of Theology is an enormous moneymaker. We have enormous profits coming into the School of Theology from that program. Now, you're struggling in the psych school with finances. If you move that MFT into the clinical program, you will have all that additional income into the School of Psychology, okay? So I go back to the faculty and explain to them that it's like the master's program in a university. That's where the real money comes from, not from the doctoral program. And so we agreed. 1 month later, I went to check the books and discovered they had not been charging the marriage and family program for overheads. They weren't paying anything from mowing the lawn or painting or the offices. But the moment marriage and family became in School of Psychology, they dumped all those costs back on us. And we had to, Dennis Guernsey and I had to sit down and start to do some heavy thinking. So that little secret is now in the open. And that's why we had all those problems in those years. Thank you.
There's no way to follow the two of you. Wow. I was a student here when Neil became dean and Arch became associate dean. And those are my student years. I was under their leadership. So I told Arch not too long ago, most of what I learned about psychology was from him. Half of my transcript were courses taught by Arch. And I worked as a student assistant to Neil, so I got to see how difficult it was to be dean. And I appreciated the battles that they were all fighting to get us APA approved and to make the program get the recognition it deserved. So as a student, my time here at Fuller changed my life. So when the opportunity to come back on the faculty came, I really wanted to do that, partly because I appreciated so much the role that Fuller had had, and by that time, the body of alumni was large enough and significant enough in their impact to realize that the heritage of the school and the future that it had was going to be really exciting. That's probably one of the main reasons why I came as dean at a time when the whole field was being turned upside down. There were huge changes going on in graduate education in the mental health area. Some pretty significant government funding cutbacks. The job market, particularly in the West Coast, was pretty glutted by the time I arrived here. So it was harder to get our students placed. It was harder to find them jobs. They were saddled with huge loans. And the financial driver for the School of Psych at that time was tuition. And you can't say to a student, we want you to go out and follow God's leading in serving the world and saddle them with loans that were bigger than some people's mortgages. So it was a really tough time of sitting and thinking together as faculty and students and staff during those years that I was here to think about what degree programs are going to lean us into the future, what types of enrollments, and how do we find additional financial drivers to what we're doing here. And Warren is too modest to take credit for this, but he really had a really great idea by saying, let's look for opportunities to fund some of what we do here through research. And let's get funding from private sector, from public sector. He was dreaming big about big government grants that would help provide research, scholarships, and student assistantships, and create that kind of income flow. And that process had begun before I got here and took a big step after I left, but was right in that transition time that Warren was envisioning that. And then along with that were donors who gave even more generously or joined the family of donors so that students didn't have to bear the full burden of the cost, because it was clear that that was not going to be possible. It was a tough transition for me to go from being a student who was pretty overwhelmed to be with so many smart people in one place, to then becoming an alum who didn't have real close connections with the school, even though I was still in the area, but to then come back on the faculty. And one of the toughest things for me to get used to was how Newt Maloney would give stormy speeches in the faculty meeting and make a motion for something pretty controversial, and then 5 minutes later argue against his motion. And he did that so often that it took me a long time to get used to that. But one of the things that I did come to appreciate was how special the students are here. At a point, maybe a year and a half into my time as dean, I was so discouraged and confused about the right way forward. And I really was pretty distressed over it. And I thought of a student, an MFT student who I had met, who seemed wise and calm, neither of which I was feeling at the moment, and that was Gloria Moore. Gloria was a tribal elder in the Navajo Nation, and she was here working on her MFT degree. And she and I were not that apart in age. So I sent her a note asking her if she'd come to see me, naively thinking that that wouldn't be scary. So she came into the office concerned that something was wrong. And she saw I looked so distressed that she thought it was because of what I was about to say. But instead what I said to her was, Gloria, you know I'm in a position here where I want to help us make good decisions, and I'm totally lost. And I'm wondering if you would tell me some stories. That's really all I said. And she sat back in her chair, relieved. And then she thought for maybe 2 or 3 minutes of silence. And she talked for almost an hour without a break. And I'm going to get a little teary. It was so moving for me. And she told story after story after story by name of elders in the Navajo Nation and decisions they had made that had been good and decisions that had been bad and what the consequences were. And then she finished. And I couldn't think of anything to say except thank you. And as she was getting up to leave, I said, how many years span were those stories? And she kind of smiled and she said, you know, I'm not sure. It's 450 or 500. It's somewhere in there. And the reason I'm recalling that today is we have had wonderful faculty. There's great stories about the faculty. And we've had a wonderful staff who've made such a difference over the years. But some of the people that I've met who've had the biggest impact on my life, I met as peers when I was a student. I met over the years as an alum. And I met when I was back here again on the faculty. Whatever God's doing in the world, this is one of the places where he brings people to get trained and get sent out again. And Fuller does so many things, but that's probably the thing at the end of the day that we ought to be most proud of, are the fine students that this place produces. So that's, so I was thinking of Gloria this morning. I would love to have had her say, well, what do I say today?
I came to interview at Fuller in 1984, and I was coming from Chicago. I didn't know where I was going, so I called somebody here. I can't remember who, maybe Newt, and he encouraged me to fly into Long Beach Airport. Of course, having not been here before, I didn't know where that was or how close, but anyway. I got into Long Beach, and I had met Newt probably earlier because I was here for an ethnic minority mental health conference, and that was my first introduction to Fuller. So I recognized Newt after I got off the plane and was walking through looking, and Newt took me to his car for my ride up to Pasadena. And this was a red convertible Cadillac DeVille, Coupe DeVille. And we were in that boat on the freeway with a top down. And I said something about the car, and Newt said, you like this car? I said, yeah, I like the car. And he said, you ought to buy it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to a used car salesman. So, but this morning as Newt spoke, I realized why he made me the offer to sell me his car. He was really interested in getting the Rolls Royce that he talked about, so if he got rid of that. But I remember feeling a sense of warmth, camaraderie, acceptance, and love from that very, very first trip from the airport up to Fuller. And I must say, after coming to Fuller and settling in this place, it has obviously become a second home for me. And one of the things in my own deanship that I think about a lot are the number of people whose retirements I had to plan. And it has always been a blessing to me to do that. And part of the zeitgeist is to see the founding faculty, the faculty on whose reputation the school was built, the faculty who struggled in the early years to get APA approval, the faculty who struggled to build this place,
that generation has passed on, has moved on. And our task, I think Jim's task and my task, have been to bring in a new generation of faculty and hope that the same level of integrity, deep belief in God's grace, commitment to integration continues among a new generation of faculty. And so it's just a pleasure to sit here and see everyone who have been here, and to think that I'm in that transition place myself, because we now, or me now, will say goodbye as I have watched others say goodbye. But this has been a marvelous ride for now near 30 years. Of course, I should say I wouldn't be sitting here as dean if this guy had not invited me to become his associate dean, and with persistence came back 3 times after I said no twice. So, but working alongside of him those 5 years when he was dean taught me much. And I've always said, those of us who become deans after the first deans always build on the work of those who have gone ahead of us. So to Travis, to Neil, to Arch, and to Jim, I want to thank you for all the work that you have done to make this place what it is. That's given space for those like me who have come behind, and Mary who will come next, to continue this work. Thanks.
Thank you for all of that. Let me ask each of you kind of 2 questions that are maybe related, maybe not related. But one question is, what was the biggest challenge to the School of Psychology during your years as dean? And the second question is, how did the School of Psychology relate to the church during that time? I know early on, probably, Neil, that was not an easy road. And I think that's maybe changed. But Neil, you want to start with that?
Well, clearly the biggest challenge that we went through, I think, was there were all those things that Arch was talking about, and that Paul led us in terms of getting approved by the American Psychological Association. But beyond that, I believe we had social ferment going on that now has become national ferment, you know. And we had the Group of 5, we called them, the Group of 5. And they wrote to the American Psychological Association leaders and suggested that we were not worthy of continued APA approval because of the way we treated certain issues like the homosexual issue and so forth. And so we had, I believe it was about 4 heads of departments from around the country that were appointed by the American Psychological Association to come out and look at us, scrutinize us, to see if we deserve to continue to be approved. That was for me the beginning of the end. I didn't enjoy that. That was a hard issue. It's still a hard issue. You may know that at eHarmony we've gone through that same issue when the Attorney General of the state of New Jersey decided to demand that we put up a site for gays and lesbians. Now, I want to make this very clear. My position on the gays and lesbians is that we don't know enough yet. I don't think we know enough to take a strong stance in either direction. I've talked this over many times with a very close friend of mine, Richard Mao, who has had so much influence on the church, as you know. And I said, you know, what I thought that at eHarmony we should have done is put up $10 million as the start of a fund to do research in that area. It's the most unique thing I've ever seen to have a major social issue like that divide our country right down the center, and we really don't know the etiology of homosexuality. I've talked a lot to Winston at various times and Warren at other times that we need a major fund to understand more about this before we start saying things that are so strong in one direction or another that it separates us. We get mad at each other. That was the biggest, I think, issue that we had to go through. But your second question about the role of the church, I can still remember, one of my closest friends was a student named David Bach. Is Dave here by any chance? He's not here. And Dave's gone through a lot of physical challenges. Dave was fathered and parented by some very strong, very reasonable but conservative people who were very close to President Hubbard. And Dave didn't go to church while he was toward the end of his time here. Is that fair, Cliff? And we found that many of our students kind of dropped out of their faith while they were here, only to return to their faith when they left here. It was almost like the prodigal son. They had to go into the far country in order to find themselves. And Dave was a very, very thoughtful person. Well, I can still remember the moment that Dave talked to President Hubbard about the fact that he dropped out of the church and he thought that that was a good thing. And that President Hubbard became very irate. He was the president for 30 years, there's no question. He did a great deal of good for Fuller. He preceded Rich. Between them, as you know, 50 years of being president of this institution. But Dave he had a strong temper, and he had a real temper for people who didn't think clearly, and he didn't think Dave was thinking clearly. And so I would say that was the experience of an awful lot of our students who came here, was that they dropped out of their faith, only to return to their faith when they left here and had a chance to kind of find themselves.
Me? I suppose as the group of five was your killer, our struggle with the John Finch issue became my killer. David Hubbard and I were blamed for lots of things. I knew that a lot of it was not true for me, at least. I can only speak for myself. But back to that scapegoat issue again. Leaders just have to accept blame and live with it. But it was the turning point for me in my relationship with Fuller, and I tried to see it through to the end, but it led me to make the decision that I would resign from the deanship and go back to being a regular professor, where there is a much more peaceful environment, where people can't blame you for anything, and where I could get on with my life. And it's been very profitable. I've published 33 books now, we, even at my old age, I'm still in big demand and have a lot of exciting things I can do. But it was that incident and the consequences of that. You remember students were taking crowbars and removing the signs on the outside of our school. It was a terrible time, and I finally was able to put it aside. But that would be my downside.
What about the relationship with the church during the years you were dean?
The relationship with the church, I focused on ministering to pastors. And introduced a course way back when I first came. It is still the longest running course in our Doctor of Ministry program. That my belief was that I could maximize my influence by going to the top, and offer a course on personal growth for pastors. And wherever I travel, I come across many former students who have benefited from that course. So I plugged in at that level for the church.
I mentioned that during the 5 years that I was here, we went through some pretty major shifts in our degree programs and our enrollments and how we funded the graduate education here. And I think the biggest challenge wasn't simply how to balance the budget. It was to go through some strategic planning. And so we spent about a year and a half with faculty and then staff and student representation, going through a pretty laborious process, but a fruitful one, to lay out some goals and some values. We started with our values and went through the whole process. And we ended up with a path forward, but that was the biggest challenge, was to make sure that if we're going to be involved in a time of change, that we make the right changes. I'm not sure that we always went about it the right way. I know I didn't always go about those changes the right way. But the changes, a lot of them were helpful in facing us forward, and that came because of the input of every major stakeholder in the School of Psych in that process. I think our relationship with the church continued to ride on the backs of our faculty and our students who maintained involvements. Certainly, as Arch has mentioned, his leadership and Neil with the church was pretty prominent. But I think for us during that 5 years, a major turning point came when Evelyn Freed, who's here today, she and Frank endowed a chair of integration, which allowed us to bring in Al Duick, which changed the dialogue and the conversation here among students and then with the Christian community at large in a way that continues today. So I think that was a big step forward, and I'm grateful to both of them for the leadership they provided in doing that.
I think the biggest challenge still continues to be for us how to make our training program affordable for our students. And we continue to worry about and struggle with this issue of how much debt our graduates take with them when they leave our programs. We have made strides in that area because of folk in the room who have been quite generous in setting up scholarships and fellowships and so forth. But that continues to be a big area of concern. And it's not just students, it's also a concern for how we sustain and support and maintain young faculty who come to be part of our community. We are having a difficult time keeping up with peer institutions on the secular side who hire bright young faculty coming out of graduate school or postdocs to make their careers in the future. So those two things still continue as major concerns for us. I would just say that our relationship with the church, as Jim said, is really seen nicely in the work that faculty do, that Newt and Richard Hunt and Al, Alexis Abernathy, Jeff Bjork, Cynthia Erickson, Pam King. We could just go on and on and on about the very significant roles that are being played in local congregations. And then we just arch ministers around the world to major denominational bodies, to the pastors. Jack and Judy do the same thing. So, and Xiang Yan, yes. And of course, Neil's work in eHarmony has been a major blessing to Christians seeking spouses. And your work has really involved working with Christian groups and churches across the board. So Fuller has made this huge contribution as a school of psychology. Yet I think our greatest contribution to the church has been what was referenced in our service on Thursday, to bring a healing presence to individuals, to children, to couples, and to families in the name of our Lord in all the Christian communities that our graduates serve.
We have a few minutes for questions, so we'll take the Brad Strawn rule. That is, make sure it's a question and make it succinct, and have an opportunity to ask the deans. And go to the mics so we can capture the, all hear the question and capture it on the video. So, Richard, you're first. Well,
I just have to ask how we got these facilities here that we're comfortably seated in.
Arch, I think you need to answer that one. Or maybe Neil.
No,
Mike?
when it, I'm on, yeah. This was the man who, in the last few years of his deanship, began to visualize a substantial, impressive building that would house the School of Psychology. Port Clement wasn't interested in raising money to build a new building. He wanted it for the students. Can you believe that? Students came first before Paul. But with Neil, we would never, ever become a distinguished School of Psychology in a double-story house fronting on the next street, where our lab was the garage, or as they say in Britain, the garage. That was on the back corner there. It would never happen. And the time came, and Neil actually got the funding settled, and then quit, leaving me to follow up with my engineering background to set up this building. And a lot of care and attention went into the design of this building, if I could just say so. Neil had suggested at the time that I visit some of the other schools of psychological centers that were being developed. I remember that Baylor, not Baylor, not Biola, the Mormon Church, they had put up a fabulous psychological center. And such things as making sure that the sound isn't being carried from one room into another. Can you believe that? That the doors had to be solid wood. You can't have panel doors because anyone can stand at the door and listen to a therapy session. There was a mountain of little details like that needed to be attended to, and I had a ball. Yeah. I had a ball. But it's Neil that we really need to thank for the initializing and having the vision towards the end of his deanship for us to have the wonderful facilities that we share as a gift from God.
Yep.
I'll add a couple of things to that. When I came to Fuller, we were still in the two-story Spanish house. And every now and again I would see Arch with blueprints. And one day he seemed really worried. I said, what was wrong? And he said, we're wondering where the steel is that was coming to build this house. So Arch was deeply involved in the details of the construction. But it fell to me sometime later to think about how we would rename the building. And as you know, it's, Annette and C. Davis Weyerhaeuser building that's on the front. So I tried to get the history. I think I talked to Rich and some other people, and I was directed to call Max Dupree. So I said, Max, I'm trying to put a plaque together to sort of honor all the people who contributed financially to the building. And he says, well, I really don't know how you're going to do that. What are you going to do about a Hubbard? What are you going to do about Bill and Gail? What are you going to do about, I'm not so important, but all the folk. So from Max Dupree, the list of names out there came forward. I, of course, didn't know the history, but just to thank Neil for the deep friendships and to thank Arch for carrying on that tradition, and to thank Bill and Gail and Max Dupree and David Allen Hubbard and so many, many others whose gifts are in the walls of this place. Thank you.
Well, you see my history. He was my dean. He was my colleague. He was a student.
You were not married to me, man.
All right. All right. Now, this is the truth. We were never married. There was no divorce. So,
For you who don't know, this is Phyllis Hart.
and I was a thorn in his side for many years because people would see the names and would assume the same institution. That must be a lovely husband and wife. Well, Neil, I am very, very sad that you didn't mention your singular legacy. I think you've got marriage on the mind or something. You introduced women faculty in 1976. Come on. We did it. I think I was brought here because I had worked 10 years in a mental hospital. And they were pretty sure I could handle students. Now, Guy was a little problem there, but other than that. But I do want to honor Hendrika Van de Kamp. She came the year I came, 1976. I think she stayed for, 25 years, I believe. The difference between us was humongous. She was a scholar. And of those of you who had her for advisor know that. How you suffered through her orals and stuff, but amazing person. She was another one like Paul that kept us in good with the APA. Mm-hmm. She was the head of one of the divisions. She did papers every year. She was very well known in the APA, and I want to honor her for that. But thank you, Neil.
I'll do it. Move along.
Vote against it, Newt.
This is a question preceded by a statement.
A short statement, correct?
When I came for the interview here, I was able to attend the doctoral defense of the first graduate, Bill Evans. Now, having that as a statement, is it not true that the building of this building and the paving of the car park out here solved two major problems? One was the snake that got loose in the woodwork of the old building and was always a threat to come out on Marnie's legs. And in the building here, which took over the old Child Development Center, also solved the problem of loose squirrels, which were left from our friend Paul Clement's research.
I have a very different kind of a question. With all of the experience here in front of us in the field, I'd be interested in hearing from each of you, what's the most important thing that you think the School of Psychology needs to address in the coming decade?
I'd love to speak on that. We're trying to do it at eHarmony. We have two families here who are represented on our board, and we feel it very important. eHarmony can't make it, really, with the kind of budget we have to have for advertising. We spend $90 million a year on advertising, and so you have to make the $90 million, and then you have to try to make the money for the people that work for eHarmony. That's 175 or 180 people, and then you have to hope that you have a little bit left over for shareholders and so forth. So we came to the conclusion that matching people for marriage is about a $2 billion a year industry in the United States. But matching people for jobs, that's about a $70 billion a year industry. So we've started a team now to match people for jobs, and it's a long process. It's a very difficult process. You have to understand the culture of the company you're matching them to. You have to understand the personality of the people in the company that you are trying to match candidates with. And along with that, we came to the conclusion that this is the loneliest time in the history of America for people. John Cassiopo is on our board. He is not on our governing board, but he's on our treatment board. And John Cassiopo says that there's never been a time, 40% of all the people in America do not have a single confidant. And it's growing at a rapid rate, so we've got to address the issue of friendship. And then we've got the other issues, like, for instance, we understand that people don't understand their own brains. David Brooks has written the most important book I've ever read, and that is The Social Animal. And you know he's the leading writer for the New York Times. And David Brooks says that we only have in consciousness about 6% of what's going on in our brain, 5 or 6%. And all the rest is like, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie Her, or maybe the movie that we got involved with, which is The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. But most of us don't have very much conscious access. We have access, but we don't have very much conscious knowledge of what's going on in our brain. And we believe, coming out of this Rogerian background of mine, that the only way to get that is through a phenomenological approach where we go in and ask the person to focus. The individual is the only person who can tell you what they're thinking or feeling at any given time. But they don't have that in consciousness. But once you ask them the question, very often they'll be able to do that. So we have 10 of these verticals that we would like to be able to build that would be as good as, we've had 600,000 marriages in eHarmony, and we've got a divorce rate that's less than 4% so far. And if we could have that same kind of success matching in some of these other areas, I think it'd be great. I would love to see the School of Psychology play an important part in the relationship process across the board, all the relationships that are key to human progress.
My focus has, my latest book, The Digital Invasion, is a wake-up call to colleges, universities, parenting, etc., to deal with the growing pathologies related to digital overuse. I'm consulting with Liberty University right at the moment, Biola University. With Liberty, we're going to be setting up a wellness center. You know, they've got 16, 17,000 students, all of whom are potential addicts to the digital lives that they live. And I think that our program really needs to pay attention to the whole digital pathologies that are emerging because they're not going to go away. And we are facing very, very severe pathologies in the future. Right now in China and Korea, there's concern because they have discovered that teenagers are suffering from digital dementia. Teenagers setting up clinics all around. It's a major issue that we have to wake up to.
Thank you.
I'm thinking back to an interview with Dan Rather when he retired from 60 Minutes. Some of you may have seen that. And they asked him what was his biggest regret. And he said, I wish I'd said more about the poor. And I'm thinking a little bit about that as we think about some of the dialogue that's going on nationally. I'd love to see Fuller have an even bigger voice in advocating for the needs of the poor, because it feels like there's less and less of a public voice for that. So.
Next question? Yep.
I'm Charlene Underhill Miller, and I arrived here in the Marriage and Family Department right about the time the Baldwicks did, when we were Marriage and Family Ministries in the School of Theology. And so I want to thank you, Dr. Hart, for the adoption and for bringing us into the family of the School of Psychology. I was blessed to be able to return here to receive my PhD under Jim Guy's leadership with the School of Psychology Marriage and Family Therapy program. And so one hope that I have for Fuller in the future is that we continue the dialogue between the clinical psych program and the marriage and family program. And that is a great, great vision, I think, for the future. And thank you, Winston, for always being open to conversations. And thank you for your leadership. And I have to say thank you to my wonderful faculty here, the Baldwicks, Jim Furrow, Cameron Lee, and the list goes on.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you. Earlier today, the pillars and the leaders, we are so thankful for the coming together of the schools of psychology and the School of Marriage and Family. And when I came in '72 and went into the second year of the Marriage and Family program in '73, we didn't know of the marriage that would happen based on money in the '80s. But what we did know was that there was a sweetness with Dr. Jewett, Dr. Smeads and his Mysterium Tremendum, and Dr. Bauer and Dr. Baker. So I am so thankful for what we have now, what we had then, how women became so much a part of all, as Gail and I were here with 15 women out of 500 men, and now I have no question because we have now Mary Clements as well. So thank you.